was once part of a geothermal wonderland.
It's like a fairy tale. Once upon a time there was a lake. Now there is no lake. And that's the hurting part of our people and what's happening now there.
For 3 decades, Aotearoa was a dumping ground. Today, it's toxic.
It is like a cancer. It's covered in with 600,000 cubic metres of carcinogenic, industrial contaminant-bearing waste.
And that carcinogenic waste is on Māori land.
I don't want my grandchildren, great-grandchildren to be born into this rubbish. There won't have anything left.
The rubbish came from the former Tasman Pulp and Paper Mill, where fortunes were made before it closed down in 2021, leaving the community of Kawerau high and dry.
There's a lot of wealth that was generated in that town. I can't really see that wealth still there. I see a lot of poverty and I see a lot of contamination.
There's a lot of bad stuff in this country around pollution and toxic sites. This was the most egregious and the most legally enforced and most harmful thing that I think I've ever seen.
And now there's concern legislation being pushed through Parliament could create similar far-reaching problems elsewhere.
My message to you and all the listeners is don't take one single event and catastrophize it and imagine that that's the character or the trajectory of New Zealand's future.
When the Tasman Pulp and Paper Mill opened for business in the 1950s using special fast-track legislation, it promised to bring prosperity to the communities of the Eastern Bay of Plenty. Today, as Aotearoa debates the merits of new fast-track legislation, Mata examines the toxic legacy created by the Tasman Pulp and Paper Enabling Act.
When we were young, that was our playground. We used to go by the hot pools and the spring. There was our source of getting food for our people there. We used to gather the kakahi, the freshwater mussel there, tuna, kawerau, inanga, all those foods that used to flow up their way there.
For generations, the whānau of Tōmairangi Fox were the kaitiaki of Lake Rotuiti-Paku, home to the famous tupuna Tuwharetoa, whose tribe bears his name.
When young Tuwharetoa was left in the care of his grandparents, Hene Tereki and Waitahari Kore, young Tuwharetoa was still being fed from the mother's breast. The kui, Hene Tereki, said to the karaua, go up in up reaches, and anyway he went in up reaches there and hit the rock, and water came up and filled the calabash up, took it back to young Tuwharetoa there and fed that water to him. Hence, to this day, the name of that spring, the Waiu or Tuwharetoa. That's our whakapapa.
Te Waiu, the nourishing milk of Tuwharetoa, fed Lake Rotuiti-Paku, a place rich in both history and biodiversity.
It wasn't until they started pouring that sludge into Rotuiti-Paku, and that there started getting bigger and bigger and wider, where we lost the lake completely.
A New Zealand pulp and paper company.
The story of how Rotuiti-Paku was lost is a toxic mix of poor decision-making and corporate profits, wrapped up in the promise of economic opportunity.
The Tasman Pulp and Paper Company's mill is the most impressive industrial landmark man has made in New Zealand.
Tasman began its life as a joint venture between the Crown and Fletcher Holdings. Powered by geothermal energy, the mill was established to process mature pine trees from nearby Kawerau, a state-owned forest planted by prisoners and the unemployed on land wrongfully taken from Māori.
So a town, an industrial town, designed for a very special purpose, was born here at Kawerau, beneath Mount Edgecombe.
And to help the mill achieve that purpose, the government passed special fast-track legislation, the Tasman Pulp and Paper Company Enabling Act 1954. Colleen Skerritt-White is a trustee of the Waiū Settlement Trust.
Well, it really gave the government authority to do whatever they needed to do to establish the mill. And that included putting in the railway to the port, establishing the port of Tauranga. So that gave them the use of the Public Works Act to take the land that they wanted. So basically that's how they established.
The mill was built on whenua Māori, acquired through the Enabling Act. The Act also allowed for the dumping of waste.
So where did the waste go?
First of all the waste went into the Tarawera River.
The Tarawera shares its name with the volcano that destroyed the pink and white terraces when it erupted in 1886. It runs past Kawerau, across the Rangitaiki Plains, before meeting the sea at Matata.
They were dumping all their waste, no matter what the waste was, but it was going into the river. Pulp fibers and all that used to flow in there, or whatever chemicals was thrown there. That liquid was mixed with PCP.
With millions of litres of industrial waste pumped into the Tarawera daily, the loss of clean water meant some local Māori could no longer farm their land. Among them, Tōmairangi's father, who ended up working at the mill. And by the 1970s, Tasman was looking for a new dumping ground.
They decided they needed to do some to land, some disposal to land. Because by that time, the river was being called the Black Drain, and people were starting to kick up a stink about all the pollution that was in the river.
The convenient place there was the Rotuitipaku, which they classed the land as a wasteland, or a place of no significance. If you weren't utilising your land, they were able to take an enabling act.
With the Enabling Act hanging over them, in 1971, the landowners of Rotuitipaku, including Tōmairangi's parents, Jack and Isabel, reluctantly agreed to lease their whenua to the mill, losing control of their land.
And when they tried to argue with the people involved there, the mill itself, they said, well, we got a lease, we've already signed it, and there's nothing you can do. So they just carried on, whether they liked it or not.
So your dad has to give up milking cows because the awa's too polluted. He goes off and works at the mill. Then the mill decides to dump waste on his whenua. He objects. He tries to block their access from Rotuitipaku. Then what happens?
He was working in Tasman there, and because of what he had done there, he was dismissed from the Tasman Mill. When they dismissed him, he had the security on both sides of him. They escorted him out, and then during that time, he was trying to seek employment around the area there, and he's blacklisted throughout the Bay of Plenty.
Jack Fox eventually got a job as a cleaner and had to watch on as Rotuitipaku was ruined.
And as Tomo said, the first lot of, they piped it up, it was liquid sludge. But because they mentioned solid waste in the first leases, they dumped all sorts of stuff up there. Wire rope, concrete, those pellets of chemicals. That's considered solid waste.
And they were also disposing drums of chemicals, sodium hydrosulfide.
To better understand the environmental impact at Rotuitipaku, I've come to Waipapa Taumatarau Auckland University, to meet with Earth Systems scientist Dr. Dan Hikuroa.
In the reports, it said there were dioxins and PCPs. There were also things like boron and arsenic, lead and zinc and copper.
Dan conducted a significant research project for Kawerau ki Tuwharetoa after he was invited to visit Rotuiti Paku in the early 2000s.
It looked like a wasteland, a nuclear wasteland. It was just dust and soil. It was all engineered and flat. The river was dangerously close to one side of it. They'd built up a big embankment on one side, and it had pulled up the water where it used to just be a beautiful little repo. And without even knowing any of the backstory for it, you just felt it in your heart that something wasn't right here.
When you look at Rotuiti Paku today, it looks okay. It doesn't actually look toxic.
If you don't know the history and the whakapapa of things, at a first glance, things can appear normal, can appear thriving even. And so if you didn't know the history for Rotuiti Paku and you went past it today, I can imagine when I was last year, and this is almost a decade ago now, they were putting some plantings in, and they were trying to make it look beautiful. But I would use an analogy of putting a Band-Aid on a cancer. And so simply putting some plants on the top is just like putting a Band-Aid on it. You could argue you've done something, but it's not going to fix it.
It's been described by some as environmental vandalism. How do you view it?
Environmental vandalism, in a way, it suggests that there was an intent to create harm. I don't actually know that the people who did this had an intent to create harm. But best practice at the time when this was enabled, 50s and 60s, was to build your industrial processes on the banks of a river. You can bring water in for your processes and then you can dump your waste out. A catastrophe, yes. I think vandalism implies an intent to wreck. I don't know that that was ever the intent. Nevertheless, that's been the outcome.
Is that kind of the nub of the issue? No one sets out to deliberately cause damage, but when you remove protective measures, that can be the end result.
Absolutely. The whole reason we have kind of those processes in place is to ensure that good, sound reason and experts in the field, experts in those areas that are to be considered, make the decisions, that there's no political implications, that there's no kind of biases that are introduced, that you get independent experts who say, if you do this, here's the range of outcomes that could happen. And if you do that, here's the range of outcomes that would happen. It appears that for the Tasman Act, that just went straight through, and maybe that could be happening for the fast-tracking bill as well.
The Tasman Pulp and Paper Mill isn't just a story of environmental damage. It's also about economic failure.
It's kind of like a pyramid scheme. You'd call that a pyramid scheme, wouldn't you? That's always...
At its peak in the early 1980s, Tasman employed 2,000 workers, and a network of whānau, small business and communities thrived.
Yeah, up here is the house that Mum and Dad built. And everyone here was workmates. So they all worked at the mill, and all of the kids went to the local school, and so it was a real little mill town. Back then, Kawerau, circa 1980.
Bay of Plenty Regional Councillor Toi Iti grew up here when his dad, artist and activist Tame Iti, worked at the mill.
Yeah, it was the Wild West back in the day, Kawerau, boomtown. So my father was working, I think it was called a shunter, on the railway tracks down there at Tasman. I think secretly he was there for the unions. So yeah, we used to hang out in Kawerau. It was a place flush with activity and yeah, all the money and benefits that came from that mill.
And so life revolved around the mill in Kawerau?
Oh yeah, it was central. The mill itself, Tasman, was the big game in town, definitely.
The chances are that today you own your own house and garden. If you do, the company probably made it possible. If you don't...
So how did Kawerau go from an economic powerhouse to one of Aotearoa's most impoverished communities? In 1979, the government sold its shares in Tasman. They were later absorbed into the newly formed multinational Fletcher Challenge. In the 80s, the Forestry Service was restructured with mass job losses, and in the 90s, state forests were sold off. Meanwhile, the mill was becoming increasingly automated, with waves of workers being laid off. But the technological developments that enabled the newsprint mill to replace its workforce would ultimately spell its demise.
Remember those yellow pages, daily newspapers, weekly coupons? All these everyday staples were quickly becoming obsolete. With the demand for newsprint shrinking rapidly, so too were the profits. And in 2000, Fletcher Challenge sold Tasman to the Norwegian-based company Norsk Skog. So you moved back to Kawerau in 2007. What does it look like?
It had become the suicide capital of New Zealand for a bit there. There was certainly most of the shops in town, which when I was a kid were bustling and full and doing great, were empty. And that is the long-term story of Kawerau. Still an amazing community. I loved it because it had per capita the most parks and reserves in the country. But I definitely saw the difference, the marked difference in terms of it seemed that all of the economic benefits had left town.
And for those who stayed?
The economic boom had gone, obviously, and that leaves a social impact where people become dependent upon that income when it's not there en masse for a whole community. What does that do to a community? And so definitely, you know, suicide, addiction, those kinds of social unwellness factors do certainly emerge. And then just the environmental impact. There is a substantial contamination that is left.
Since taking ownership, Norsk Skog Tasman reduced production. In 2021, it announced it would end newsprint operations and sell off other parts of the mill. Then in March this year, with multiple legal claims relating to Rotuiti Paku, Norsk Skog Tasman placed itself in liquidation.
I think this is really the cautionary tale that ultimately it is the community who is the last man standing, holding the baby. So after the politicians have moved on and they've done their job, like with the Tasman Enabling Act, and the shareholders have gotten their profits and they decide to leave town, the community are left there to clean it up.
It's estimated the cost of cleaning up Rotuiti Paku is upwards of $1 billion. And there are 6 landfill claims against Norsk Skog Tasman lodged with the court. A spokesperson for Norsk Skog says the liquidator is handling those claims, which are the subject of arbitration.
So nobody really knows what's going to happen in the future. But unfortunately now the liability sits with the trustees, with the landowners. So,
how can that be?
Because they've left. They packed up and they left.
And it's not just the lake, the whenua and the river that's been contaminated. Historically, it was the people who worked at the Tasman Mill site too.
I hear the stories of back in the day they get into the dioxin pools and with no protective gear on and would do the job that they were there to do, and the evidence has borne out that that wasn't a bright idea and a lot of people got sick.
Among them, Tō Mairangi, who ended up working on the lumber mill's green chain, where pine timber was dipped in the highly toxic pentachlorophenol known as PCP.
I never knew it was dangerous. And it wasn't until we found it afterwards, that when I say found it afterwards, by then I was about probably 10 years down the track there, I found out that it was PCP and all that there. Now, there's a swap, some more workers against poison. And now I've got to go next week there for my yearly check to check my health, their blood test and all that.
These things are horrible. They are horrible chemicals. They're made in the laboratory and they come out in your body because they lock into you and you can't stop it. There's no real treatment for it. And so it's pretty desperate.
Former Green Party MP and Toxics spokesperson Catherine Delahunty and her partner Gordon Jackman have a long association with Rotuiti Paku and have spent years fighting for workers poisoned on the job.
These were strong, rugby-playing, healthy young men going to work to feed family and then coming home with these terrible disorders.
What kind of disorders are linked to PCPs?
So it's everything from diabetes to heart disease to cancers to weird kind of bone growth stuff. If you're lucky, it's just a skin disease. For women, it's about fertility, it's about babies with holes in the heart. It's like all of it.
PCP was eventually banned in 1988, but not before countless workers had been poisoned.
So these people were living and are living, those who haven't died yet, with multiple complex disorders. And all that government has been able to come up with was that they're allowed to go to the doctor for free once a year, and that's a GP who doesn't understand the issue. They need specialist care, and they primarily need an acknowledgement. They need the resources to have the best life they can have, given what corporate power has, with government collusion, has done to them.
Now cemeteries are full. Our urupa are full of them. Mill workers. He's our John along.
Colleen believes the mill and local forestry is still affecting the community, including the tamariki.
They're all cousins. All of them, my kids.
Yeah. We gotta be famous.
One line, please. Come on, first 10 out there.
Diabetes is huge. Asthma, eczema, allergies. Yeah, we all suffer from those with our families and our muckles. Asthmas are terrible for the babies. And so those problems are still here. The health system sucks big time. You gotta wait 2 weeks to get a doctor's appointment. A lot of our people don't even go to the doctor. They try and heal themselves at home, because it's such a rigmarole now to get into the doctors or get any help whatsoever.
It's their future. So things have got to change drastically.
Because I am haunted by the testimonies I heard over many years on the marae and in the hearings in the Bay of Plenty. I honour those elders who have gone now, who told us their terrible stories of a beautiful water source turning black overnight in 1955, of a government who passed an act to enable pollution from a large business whose profits were made by externalising the costs into a river that became the Black Drain.
When you made your maiden speech in Parliament, you talked about the Tasman Pulp and Paper Enabling Act. Tell me, all these years later, what do you make of it?
When companies run the government, and that's what free market capitalism allows, you will get laws that either in their entirety, like the FastTrack bill, or in their specifics, like the Enabling Act and then the Resource Management Act, you will get laws that allow this kind of absolute abuse of justice. And so, that is what happened, and that's what's happening again.
Catherine fears the history of Kawerau could be repeated if the coalition government is successful in passing a new consenting law which allows developers to bypass environmental protections and democratic scrutiny.
The government's FastTrack Approvals Bill aims to streamline decision-making in order to deliver significant regional or national projects. But not everyone's convinced.
And that's because the bill gives ultimate decision-making power to 3 government ministers: regional development, infrastructure and transport. So I've come to Parliament to speak to one of them.
I just think it's really unwise, and it's almost feeding into an ideological narrative that we're going to be incarcerated by the many mistakes that reflect our nation's history. Let me put it to you another way. The fast track is in the context of some very dire economic conditions that we have. I mean, Treasury itself has said we're going to undershoot the growth of our economy by $46 billion. We've got to have a response to modernise infrastructure, but I don't want anyone thinking that the fast track is somehow a massive journey back to creating our environment, recreating our environment in the form of a lunar moonscape.
I guess the question is at what cost, and at the cost to whom and who? Because, as you say, the Tasman Pulp and Paper Enabling Act is 70 years old, but still there are whānau who are suffering terrible health outcomes because of the contaminants that they had to handle. So it totally is a question to do with the fast track, because will that happen again?
Well, I don't believe that you can singularly use that as an example to undermine the usefulness of the fast track. The fast track is going to happen, and it is going to deliver and accelerate the creation of infrastructure, both for climate change purposes, but also for jobs. Now, the specific issue we're talking about, no one should pretend that everything was perfect. No one should pretend that after a big industrial development, that in that case there were problems left behind. So my message to you and all the listeners is don't take one single event and catastrophize it and imagine that that's the character or the trajectory of New Zealand's future. You've got to take these examples and learn from them.
What are you going to do in the fast track bill that's going to hold developers to account for future perceived damage?
Well, funny you should mention that, because that happens as we speak. As you know, I'm promoting oil and gas as a contingency fuel, or certainly gas in New Zealand. All of those explorers, prospectors, developers, they have to face up now with fiscal bonds. We've learnt the lesson of what went down in the Tamarin fiasco off the coast of Taranaki. So, yes, we're right to be cautious, and we're right to challenge the behaviour of corporates, but we're not right to use that as a basis for demeaning capitalism.
Just out of interest in the Kawerau case, do you think North Scoot should be held accountable for the environmental damage?
Well, you ask a good question. How far up the corporate whakapapa tree do you go? Who do you apportion the blame to? The original company or the company that's recently held the assets? But I mean, the reality is you cannot pursue or force any legal obligation upon any entity unless you've got the ability to enforce it. And that legislation, we all know, which you are right, is an antecedent in some respects of the fast track, did not provide for that level of enforcement. And indeed, it had a provision which represented a statutory bar in terms of the discharge into rivers.
I guess therein lies the problem, is in a corporate world, you can just alleviate yourself of the problems by on-selling your business and then going into liquidation, because that's what's happened in the Kawerau situation.
The example that you cite is a grievous example. But really, unless you've got an agenda, who seriously believes that that singular, egregious case of environmental destruction is a template for how modern investors, modern firms, and modern society imagines the future's going to be?
Well, they do, because they're living amongst it and they're living with the paru around them. What's the solution, do you think, for them?
Please remind them that thousands of their relations derive multi-generational income from that enterprise, and don't singularly take one aspect of that experience and pretend that there were not a lot of host of other benefits.
For those whose relations did work at the mill, most of those benefits have long been swept away.
It really took the Ngāti Rangitihi settlement and our negotiations with the Crown for me to really understand the destruction and the desperate situations that our people find themselves in as a result of the mill.
Leith Comer is the chair of Te Mana o Ngāti Rangitihi. A former CEO of Te Puni Kōkiri, Leith was born and bred in Matata, and his whānau worked at the mill.
There was a major number of people who lived at Matata working at the mill. So again, the mill had a positive impact upon the little villages of Matata, Murupara, Te Teko, as their source of work.
But that contribution came at a cost to the surrounding iwi like Ngāti Rangitihi. Their Waitangi claim highlighted how the Crown's actions had impacted their whenua and awa, including the Tarawera River.
It was the Tasman Pulp and Paper Enabling Act of 1954, which enabled the owners of the mill to put anything they wanted into the river, and they did. And I think that we started to see sort of the impact of that beautiful river being destroyed, because on the one end, when you see the water coming in from Lake Tarawera to the end where you see it going past the mill out to sea, what impact, really bad impact that the mill had on the quality and the mauri of the Tarawera awa.
Leith's not just concerned about the environmental damage that's already occurred, he's worried about future contamination if a bund and embankment between Rotuiti Paku and the Tarawera River fails.
It's a strip of land that holds back the sludge that's in Rotuiti Paku. And all you need to do is to look down, I think, 10 kilometres down the river to Edgecombe, where you saw what happened when the Edgecombe earthquake took place. It destroyed part of, I think, the banks of the Rangataiki River, and we had enormous flooding. So it is a huge risk, and we are very keen to make sure that whoever is responsible for causing that risk is called to account and made to restore that land, so that the risk of pollution from Rotuiti Paku into the Tarawera awa is done away with.
Is that Tasman Pulp and Paper?
I think it probably goes back that far, but it certainly is Norski, who are at this stage departing.
Dr. Dan Hikuroa believes the cost of not fixing the bund and remediating the contamination is simply too high.
If that waste site fails, and it's been poorly situated right next to the Tarawera River, very weak soils, if that river changes course, like it has in the past, if we get an earthquake, which we get quite frequently down there, if there's another volcanic eruption even, that place will likely just spew out all that industrial, cancer-bearing waste right out into the river and then into Te Moananui Atoi downstream.
Do you worry about the potential risk to Māori communities if they are left out of the decision-making process by the fast-track legislation?
Well, I think there are risks, aren't there? And I think you could point to the Enabling Act of 1954. You could ask, well, who made that decision, and how could they have made that decision without consulting with Māori or consulting to justify that decision? So I think those responsible for the fast-track legislation that we're currently have to be mindful of that, and I'm sure they're going to get questioned in the select committee process to justify how they intend to do that. And unless they can give assurances, and that'll be challenging, I think they'll have difficulty convincing New Zealanders that that is good legislation.
In 2013, the lease on Rotuiti Paku finally expired. The lake, once teeming with life, now pumped full of poison, has returned to its kaitiaki. The burial place of Tūwharetoa's tupuna, now a carcinogenic tomb.
Oh yeah, it's shocking. It's embarrassing for us when they teach this history to their children. Ngāti Tūwharetoa do. When they come up there and, and then they look at you and like, why did you let this happen? It wasn't. We tried to stop it. Yeah, it's sad.
Yeah, you feel a responsibility.
Yeah, because it should never have happened. Sorry.
Good to know.
Plans for how to deal with the landfill sites are before the regional council. Norske Skog declined our request for an interview, but says the rehabilitation plans were underway before the liquidator was appointed and money has been set aside for the work. A liquidator's report says 10.3 million is held in trust and subject to arbitration. Tōmairangi says it's not enough.
It comes back to the agreement which was accepted by those companies there. At this time here, Norske Skog is that company. They had agreed to that. That is their responsibility to make it safe and to what the owners want. It's not what they want. No, don't put a sticking plaster and walk away and think that's our problem solved there. No, it's a bit more than that there.
What do you want?
I want my lake back. Whatever's on there, take it out. What's on lease, take it out. Give my lake back. Now, that's what I'm asking for. Give our lake back.
Norske Skog might have shut up shop here in Aotearoa, but it's still open for business overseas. Regardless, Toi says it's the government who has the ongoing responsibility to the people of Kawerau.
A just outcome would be that the Crown steps in and pays for the restoration. That the losses are socialised across Aotearoa, New Zealand, because Aotearoa, New Zealand has benefited from the industry that caused that contamination.
There's still a couple of mills operating in Kawerau. The businessmen who originally made their fortunes here didn't stick around, but the whānau who did are rebuilding their town. For the first time in years, the local rugby team is playing again, and Tōmairangi is here to tautoko them. As the coalition's consenting legislation is debated in communities across Aotearoa, the story of what happened here will serve as a reminder of the unintended consequences of fast-tracking. You're guaranteeing that we won't have a Kawerau situation again?
I'm very confident that no project in New Zealand going through the FastTrack or the RMA will have such a sad and toxic legacy as the Kawerau experience.
No, we need to fight it. We need to fight it. They can't do this. Because they'll put the whole environment at risk. Our people at risk. I mean, we're born with a responsibility to look after all of these taonga and hand them on to the next generation. Well, we can't do that if they keep doing this.
Te reo, te take.
Irirangi te motu, ka nui te mihi.